Welcome to the Discourse. In this episode, members of the Wayne State University Civil Discourse Fellowship talk about differences in how our communities appear from the inside and outside, and misconceptions that may exist from the external viewpoint. Enjoy!
Hi everyone, I'm Rima, and we have Zakia, Isaac, Eriq, and Bilal, and we're part of the group called The Discourse, and this is our podcast. This week we're talking about misconceptions people have about faith, whether it can be outside or outside misconceptions, so people who are not part of that faith, or the misconceptions people have within their faith as well. So, for example, with Christianity, everyone, or at least I know a lot of people think Jesus was a white guy. No, he was Palestinian. And where is Palestine? In the Middle East. Some inside misconceptions. Let's say a lot of people focus on wealth, especially in America, more of a puritanical view. And a lot of the teachings of Jesus are actually based off of we should be caring about our fellow neighbors. So I'm going to pass it off to Eriq. And we'll get the discussion, just to hear everyone's background. Eriq?
So, thank you, Rima. I do not have a particular religious, or I do have a religious background in general Protestant Christianity. The church that I used to go to consider themselves non-denominational, but that's kind of impossible. In a practical sense, because you have to believe something doctrinally, and that's going to fit in with somebody. So you can't just be like a non-denominational Christian necessarily. If you're a church, as a personal choice, that's fair. Believe the Bible, Jesus, whatever. But as an institution, you can't really be non-denominational because you're gonna spout something, and that's gonna align with somebody else. So. But personally, I came from a non-denominational Protestant background. So you believe the general things that Protestant Christians believe, which is you don't really believe in the power of the Pope. You don't believe in the legitimacy of the Catholic Church, and you cultivate a personal relationship with God above all else. You take the Bible more literally. So that's what I grew up with. Now I consider myself an agnostic atheist. And I think that atheism itself is atheism and agnosticism is it's fuzzy because there are a lot of different definitions of it. And I think that while institutions can make atheism or Gnosticism fit their agenda or ideology, whatever agenda that may be, the ideas themselves are kind of just descriptors as opposed to religions or belief system in of itself. For instance, theism and atheism are interlinked because theism is belief in a god or gods, and atheism is just not belief in a god or gods. And Gnosticism and agnosticism add and subtract from that, because Gnosticism itself just means knowledge. So an agnostic atheist doesn't believe in God or gods, but since they're agnostic, they don't know if there's a way to know. So it's I don't believe that they're there, but I can't prove it, and I'm not going to act like I can. I don't think anybody can. So that's what an agnostic atheist would say. A Gnostic atheist would say, I don't believe in God, and I know that there isn't God based on what I've seen in life, based on what I know. An agnostic theist would say, and a theist could be anybody who believes in any kind of deity, not just a Christian or a Muslim or a Hindu. An agnostic theist would be I believe there are gods out there. I believe there is a higher being, but since they're agnostic, I don't know what they look like. I don't know what they do. I don't know what they want. I don't know how many of them there are. I don't know anything about them. I just think that they're there. A Gnostic theist would say, I know there's a God up there. Not only do I believe it, I know it, and here's how I know. And a lot of the major religions fall under that category. Now, obviously, they differentiate in like the rules, the teachings, the specific scriptures and stuff. But Gnostic theism is the norm. It's believing in a God and believing that you know that they're up there. And I think that those four descriptive terms are kind of thrown around sometimes as like an insult, or as being part of some organization, when it's really not. It's just a descriptor of how you see the spiritual world, or if you believe in it at all. Actually, that's funny, because being an atheist doesn't even necessarily mean you don't believe in the spiritual world. Like, you can not believe in a god or gods, but still think that spirit and ghosts exist. So it's a lot more fluid than people give it credit for. So yeah, that's my 2 cents. I'll pass it off to Zakia.
So I thought that was really interesting what you said about agnosticism, and I guess I hadn't really thought of it that way. I know Judaism is actually pretty open to being a theist and an agnostic person, being that actually, like, in our 13 principles of faith, like, it clearly states we don't know what God looks like. We don't really know his purpose. We know that Moses was like our main prophet, but we believe, the Torah was written by God, but we don't know God. God does not smell. He does not look like anything. And I feel like a lot of that sort of questioning or sort of different ideas about what God is sort of baked into our religion. And I also feel like to struggle with God is inherently Jewish. I mean, that's where like the word like Israel comes from, is to have that sort of struggling or fighting with God or angels. And so in that sense, I find Judaism to be really liberating, because you are allowed to have those struggles, those questions, those ideas. So I find that very helpful. But I feel like if we're going to talk about this, sort of ties really nicely into inside versus outside ideas of faith. And for me, I mean, on the outside, and at least on some surface levels on the inside, it's very Judaism can be very strict and very rigid and very unaccepting of these kind of core beliefs, or unaccepting of some people's interpretation of Jewish law. And sometimes I feel like over time we've become stricter, not more lenient. And I think some of it is out of acts of desperate self-preservation and as a safeguard against assimilation. So if we look at how our ancestors would have practiced 50, 100, 200 years ago, they actually might have been more liberal. In fact, in a lot of cases, they probably were. And so I guess a problem that I seem to have, especially with like Ashkenazi leaders, is that I feel like there is this inherent exposure to early Christian and Western ideas where self-deprivation and self-denial is akin to holiness and divinity. And I feel like I do see that sort of translated in Ashkenazi literature and halachic like law rulings, which I don't actually really agree with. I feel like we have become a lot stricter over time, even if when you're kind of in the religion and you can kind of have your own personal rabbi and have like learning groups where you can talk candidly amongst each other. I mean, I feel like that's a little bit more exposed, that the core of our religion isn't meant to be so rigid. Whereas the outside and definitely some surface levels of Judaism are very rigid. And I feel like almost to the point where they sort of forget the point, forget that they're there to be servants of God, to be there to serve God. I feel like it really does kind of fall into this competition of self-deprivation and how strict can we be. And like I said, some of it is a safeguard against assimilation. So that's sort of my view on the inside out of at least Judaism. I guess maybe specifically the orthodoxy and Ashkenormative orthodoxy at that. So I think I'll hand it off to Isaac because he might disagree with me.
No, I think you have excellent insights. I just want to start from scratch with my own opinion on the entire misconceptions question. So the Jewish community is very diverse, and even within subgroups, there's diversity of opinion, practice, all that stuff. And so it's kind of true that whatever your conception is, it will be true of some Jews. The problem is when you make it into some general principle and you start prejudging people, assuming that they fit into this category already. So I'm going to give some sort of completely diametrically opposed examples, and these are real people you will find, but you should not think that I'm one of them, right? So here's one, a common misconception. Jews don't really believe in God. Their synagogues are really more focused on liberal political stuff, sort of social justice, LGBT rights. That's the main focus of Jews. Such synagogues do exist in America. There are a lot of people who consider that their Judaism. Nonetheless, not me. And then here's another misconception, which is partially true, but still a misconception. Jews are, they take their devotion to God so seriously that they cut themselves off from external society, never interact with the outside world, don't speak the language of the countries they live in, don't watch TV, use the internet, read newspapers outside of their own publications, because they don't want to be corrupted by the secular society. Again, that exists in the United States. So if that's your conception, I can't quite say that it's a misconception, but on the other hand, for a lot of, if you are trying to imagine that that's most people in the Jewish community, it is a misconception. So it's a nuanced thing, and it's difficult for me to say straight up, you're wrong, Jews aren't like that, because there are going to be Jews who are like that, whatever it is that your misconception is. But all the same, prejudgment is prejudice. So wait to find out from who you're talking to where they're coming from. One thing I did think of, though, is also that there are historical facts which there are misconceptions on, which are like there is really only one reality to it, and I hate to go here, but because this was brought up, this person known as Jesus was one of us. Many of his followers were not, but he was. And in the time and place that he lived, he was under Roman occupation in Judea, which before the Roman occupation was known as the Kingdom of Judah. And the period where it was renamed to Syria Palaestina was some 100 years after his death. It would be an anachronism to refer to any of the Jews in that region at that time as anything other than Jews or Judeans. So that's my opening statement. And all that's left is to hear from Bilal.
Okay, hi. So, I'm not sure if, although I get like that, some sources may say that it was like formerly Palestine or it was formerly such and such. It doesn't actually change the main point of it being that specifying the region, as far as I'm aware. But clarify that after I share it. Hopefully. Oh, go ahead.
Well, would you refer to Sitting Bull as an American?
No, I wouldn't, but I would say that, like, in a historical context, it's like, for example, I think I was reading about Lord Wellington in a book the other day, and the person decided to say, it's just to be clear though, he wasn't they're talking about in his childhood, right? He wasn't called Lord Wellington in his childhood. They referred to him what he was referred to, when he was a kid. So I wasn't sure if, regionally speaking though, are they the same area?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
I'd like to make a small interjection on that. So when the Romans conquered, they named the area Palestine. That is not its historical name at all whatsoever.
Well, no, but again, that was in like 135 CE. They renamed it, but during the time that Jesus was alive, the Romans had already conquered. It was a Roman province, but the Romans called it Judea.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
But even when they renamed it, it was specifically renamed as kind of like an FU to the Jews, like, we conquered you, haha, we're going to name your land after the people that you hate. And I feel like using that is sort of like, it's very politically charged at the moment. And as far as I'm aware, there really aren't Jewish Palestinians. So I feel like it does take away from Jesus's Jewish identity.
Or depending on how you view it, all Jews are Palestinians.
Well, I reject that, and I think every Jew would.
Okay.
So.
Well, I actually no. I'm in favor of.
We can let Bilal talk.
Okay, so misconceptions. So I think similarly, in the same kind of vein of thought that Isaac brought forward was Islam is not monolithic, and Muslims are not monolithic, and as such, it does help to actually treat people as individuals and allow them to express their views as opposed to prejudging them. And are there people who you genuinely don't want to cross the street if they're there, or maybe you would want to cross the street if they're there? Muslims, yes, there are. There are Muslims who I would say to you that, like, they are gentle people, but ideologically they are more dangerous than wolves. So there are also other people who are so, I would say, watered down that it's more of a cultural practice than any sort of ideology in any direction. So yeah, I'll give an example. If a person, are there people who genuinely, with all of their heart, believe that people outside of the Muslim faith, Muslims who believe that people outside the Muslim faith will be in heaven? Yes, there are. There absolutely are. Are there also Muslims who believe that nobody after the time of the Prophet Muhammad having spread the message of Islam throughout, the Arabic world and then through the, Rome and Persia, after that message has been out, like, everyone is officially considered liable if they do not join Islam, and also if they do not join Islam, they have no opportunity to go to heaven whatsoever. Like, they're done. Like, that's it. Doesn't matter the kind of lifestyle you live. Doesn't matter if you're in good faith striving your whole life to look for what makes the most sense. Because, anywho, there are people who do hold that view, and they even go so far as to, going further down that line to dehumanize people, and not, obviously they wouldn't say this literally. They wouldn't say, oh, they're not humans. But in the way that they feel that they should be treated, they dehumanize them in in their expectations. And I'm not talking about like, okay, they have an expectation that they should be taxed and they're not allowed to join the army. It's like, okay, that's that's something, but that's not the same thing as dehumanizing. But there is people who would do that for the sake of dehumanizing. It's not a matter of like politically there's distrust among groups or anything like that. So like this is like a defense mechanism or like a security, like a homeland security kind of thing. No, some people would use it like this is our way of enforcing it on them because they're inferior currently in their mindset and they have to come to understand this. And that range is pretty far. One people are saying, like straight up, I think I'll see you in heaven, and other people are saying that like I'm certain, with utter certainty, you'll be in hell, which is pretty I think those are quite literally, as opposite as you can get. And there are also Muslims out there who, and there are, I think that, I can't say, based off my anecdotal experience, what the whole population is like. But I know that if you were to look at things like through a spectrum of theistic probability, and this is a term that comes from a book written by Richard Dawkins, but just basically that, like, how strongly do people hold a view? And that doesn't it kind of correlates with agnosticism, because it's like kind of, but it's not the exact same thing, because agnosticism is really about believing that the knowledge for something exists or lack thereof, right? It's like, if you're agnostic, you believe that it's possible to know. And then if you're agnostic, it's not truly possible to know, like, ultimately. So in that, some Muslims believe that you should be like 100% fully believing theistically, and then others believe that you wrestle with the idea, like it's a person, like it's a process. You have to be genuine with yourself. Like if you are not fully convinced of something, right? Like let's say there's 10 ideas on the table, and each of them are at 60% of what you're convinced for each of these ideas. And someone tells you, hey, if you don't believe in this idea, you're going to hell. That is not a logical conclusion. Like, so someone would say, no, it makes perfectly good sense for a person to be questioning the belief or even leave the belief for a period of time, and that's perfectly fine. Other people would take the extreme end and they'd say, if a person leaves the faith, and these people do exist, and you'll find them in like small pockets of Iraq, right? Even today, called a very famous group known as ISIS. That oh, you left the religion? Well, that makes your blood halal, which is a really disgusting phrase to even think about, because what that means is basically saying killing you is not considered a sin because you left the religion. And it's like, clearly you maybe just myself, but it makes you weep for the youth in that area who that it's going to happen to them. They're going to be brainwashed into this. They're going to be radicalized into becoming innocent children. And I know some children are not that innocent, but innocent children to demonic people. And so these extremely varying ranges exist. And while Islam, relatively speaking, to because there have been many Christian movements in the U.S. and North America and in Europe, it, relatively speaking, is a lot more rigid. There is a lot of room for intellectual display and learning and questioning things. And I really think that the Muslims don't reflect upon the fact that there have been dozens of intellectual movements that have reshaped the religion, or at least how we interpret it or view it, and that we just forget about it. And it's like, no, there's only one way to look at things. Like, well, you know what? 200 years ago, people said that, and then there was an intellectual reform. People changed their mind on something, and then suddenly that's canon. So it's like, if that happens every 200, 400, 600 years, right? And sometimes it's like this. It's like, 200 years pass, and one view is dominant, and the view changes, and then it goes to a previous view from like 400 years ago. So they say like, oh, I think that's more correct, right? Then how can you be so rigid and also unforgiving? And I think that's you going mildly unforgiving with when people are questioning their faith. Like it's a person who questions their faith in genuine honesty, who debates and argues for the sake of God. I don't see that as anything but like one of the purest things a person can do. I genuinely believe that an atheist who's fully convinced in atheism, who practices life as an atheist, who's doing things in good faith and genuinely trying to follow things as correct as he possibly can, like he's genuinely saying like, if I was 80% convinced of Islam, I would take it. But I'm only at 40%, and as a result, I'm not saying it's completely wrong, but like I'm not convinced. And if he's genuine with that, and he doesn't come to Islam, and he follows what he thinks is genuinely good, as far as like my full belief and with full confidence, I believe God will put him into the shade of Jannah, the shade of heaven, when he dies, when he's to be judged. Like, and I don't see how anyone can possibly think that a person in good faith and trying to seek the truth could be damned to hell.
I had a small question, and I should also say that that is beautiful, and the same goes for me. My understanding of Jewish law and theology is very similar in that. But I may have had a misconception. My reaction to your comment about blood being halal, to me, halal carried a connotation of permissible for consumption. Is that a misconception? It just means permissible in general?
Yeah, that's correct. Haram
Okay.
halal are general. It can be used like, similar to kosher when you're referring to dietary, and then that means there's a lot overlapping. That does not mean that they're same, but that would only be in the cases of dietary. So that's correct.
Okay. So it's more analogous to the Hebrew mutar, permitted. Thank you.
You taught me something there. Thank you.
Rima, did you want to add something else based on everything that we put in, or did you want to just pass it off?
You can go ahead, Eric, if you have something to say.
All right. For the audience out there, I have been looking at my phone this entire time because I've been taking notes on everybody's saying, so I can respond to it in detail without having to hold space in my brain. That usually doesn't go very well. So, Zakia, feeling like Ashkenazim were making more rigid than it needs to be. Basically, what I wrote in my notes is a summary of part of what you said. That's interesting. You say that because, and you also pointed out the separations within the groups, like how I know the term Ashkenazim, usually is meant to say European descended Jews, but the term itself means like German Jews. And Ashkenazim in general, it tends to be applied toward what's so-called West Juden and like Ost Juden, the same way, like Western Jews and Eastern Jews, Jews that lived in Western Europe and Eastern Europe. And at the time, like say in the 1800s, Western Jews would have looked down on Eastern Jews for a lot of like calling them backwards. They don't practice the way we do. They're not as liberal as us. And for them to look forward 200 years in the future, to be grouped under the same label, they'd be like, whoa, no, don't call us that. We're not the same. We're better. And the intersection between Mizrahim and Sephardim, like it depends on who you're talking to.
What do you mean by Western Jews? Are you talking like Western Germany or like Spain,
Western Europe in general,
Portugal?
like Germany, France, England, the ones that like pride themselves as like liberal, capitalist, free democratic nations.
So what's interesting, I'm not quite sure I'm understanding. But so if you're saying that the Eastern ones who were looked down on in Eastern Europe were Ashkenazim, I think that's correct. But in that same paradigm, the Western ones, being sort of Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, would be Sephardim.
Well, my understanding of the term Sephardim and Ashkenazim, like Sephardim to me, or the way I've been taught by Professor Bufich, is that it means basically Iberian Jews, like Jews from Spain and Portugal specifically. But Ashkenazim,
in the same way that Ashkenazi means German, but the term is sort of greatly expanded to cover two sort of schools of practice. There's the Ashkenazi minhag set of customs and the Sephardi minhag or set of customs, which are followed by a great number of geographic areas.
But like even Africa, for instance, most African Jews tend to be Sephardic, which is nowhere near the Iberian.
Some of them would not like you to say that. They would say, no, they'd say, no, our community, the Moroccan minhag is completely distinct. We don't follow the Sephardi.
Well, okay, fine, but there are plenty that would identify. Anyway, so I guess for theologically, I guess the main distinction would be less like geographic And more, do they follow the Shulchan Aruch as like their main halachic basis, or do they follow the Rima, which was added to the Shulchan Aruch? And Rima would be like Ashkenazi, and Sephardic would just be Shulchan Aruch.
Does the Rima override, or is it just an addition?
It's an addition, and so if you're Sephardic, you don't really recognize it, at least not in like your own personal practice. If you're Ashkenazi, it does sort of override.
Yeah. So
Okay.
Shulchan Aruch, it's the code of law formulated by Rav Yosef Karo
In the Middle
And,
East.
That's what I
about-
thought.
about
Scholarly
1,000
work.
years ago. So it's entirely the Sephardic practice, but then the Ramah made a gloss on it, which is basically marginal notes, insertions, updating it to match the Ashkenazic practice, and republished it for Ashkenazi Jews.
And that's basically how like all Jewish law is. You kind of have the Talmud, and then you have interpretations, and you have commentary, and you have this, that, and the other thing. So it's like totally valid, reasonably, within Jewish practice, at least on things where like there are multiple opinions, to say, oh, I'm following Hillel's interpretation of this versus somebody else's. And there tend to be majority opinions that kind of pick a side. But there are definitely sects and opinions that you can follow the non-majority opinion. And so like that's kind of how all Jewish law is that it's sort of layered.
Yeah, Ashkenazim and Sephardim don't view the other's practice as wrong. In that respect, I think it's similar to Catholicism and the Orthodox Church. But it's just that it's not appropriate for one person from one community to adopt the other communities, because that's disrespectful to their own community.
Well,
Anyway, I think
I would like to interject and say that there is some serious bad blood theologically and practically between the Catholic and Orthodox churches. So just letting you know.
Are they not in communion?
Oh no. They split from each other 1,000 years ago.
I'm thinking of something else. I'm sorry.
No, you're good. It's okay.
One
What
further,
about misconceptions? Okay, I was just going to say that, Zakia, because I think there are two of us Jews, and that's not fair. We're monopolizing the conversation. So
Well, yeah, I do thank you for the clarification, though. Basically, to move on to something also related to Judaism, what Zakia said, safeguarding against assimilation. That is an important point, I think, when it comes to misconceptions about groups coming from outside the community. Let's take the example of the Amish. A lot of Americans don't really know that much about the Amish, and what they do is just kind of like rumors or like, just a hearsay. And the Amish themselves don't really care like what you think of them. They just kind of like keep to themselves for the most part and just like live life. But because of that, a lot of Americans are just like, oh, what's going on over there? Oh, they wear really pointy hats. I guess they're hat lovers, huh? It's just like the Amish are like, who cares, bro? So it's like, it's because of the insularness of their community that there's no real Amish people going out and be like, hey, I give you all the scoop on Amish people. It's just like, no, they don't care. So because of that, the misconceptions develop because people just want to know and gossip about things.
I do have a real comment on that. Like, actually, I wanted to sort of talk about this anyway. I guess like a major difference between the Amish and Jews, especially like Hasidic insular Jews, is the consequence of the misconceptions. So there really aren't people making the unorthodox equivalent of the Amish people. There aren't people selling out their own community for views, for interest, for a storyline, for things like that. And when you see things like that come out, it's very disheartening to us. So there are real consequences. But another thing is that their community is so insular and in some respects sort of protected by the fact that they are a Christian sect. There are limited consequences. People might think you're weird, whereas Hasidic Jews in New York are often victims of hate crimes. And so when we have our misconceptions, it's not just as simple as somebody thinking that we're dumb or weird or stupid or whatever, because that would be annoying but fine in its own right. But you see spikes of anti-Semitism in response to people publicly condemning us, and that's a problem when people take their misconceptions and respond with violence. And so I feel like that's why it's more of a problem in our community when people make things like unorthodox or spread weird rumors about us via the media or things, or have those harmful misconceptions, because just thinking Jews are weird is fine. I mean, not great, but fine. Wanting to kill us or hunt us down in the streets because of that, not fine.
Understandable. I get that. Let's see. I think that was all from you. Isaac, misconceptions about something being partially true but wrong on too vague a level. That is an important point. A lot of times people will make misconceptions about Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, name your group. I mean, let's throw culture in there either. Often what you say will be true of some people, and it can vary on how large the group of that some people is, but usually not all, rarely, if ever not all. And that's where the misconception comes in. Like, and usually that has bad consequences. Like, Bilal, you mentioned that some people in ISIS will be like, if you were Muslim and you decided not to be anymore, we can kill you and we're not going to go to hell for that. They consider themselves Muslim and they believe that. But some other people who are not Muslim, who don't really understand the intricacies of Islam, will be like, oh, all Muslims believe that? Muslims are inherently evil. And Bilal will be like, oh, no. So, that has consequences. So it's important to point out. It's an important point, Isaac. It's also a misconception. There's often misconceptions historically within one particular religious community. Like, for instance, Christians nowadays, especially Catholic Christians from Western Europe, or I should say Western and Southern Europe, and Protestant Christians from Northern Europe and in North America. I wouldn't say Eastern Orthodox Christians so much because they are a little more connected to, they're closer geographically to the birthplace of Jesus, so they understand more of the historical context. But the other two don't really. They view Christianity as kind of like a straight line from Jesus to now, when it was really more like a vibrant conversation that people just like started editing out over the years, and then you are left with like this paltry like little sliver of information when there used to be like dozens of people arguing about it. Like the Holy Trinity, Christians for hundreds of years, in the first hundreds or so years after Jesus died, Christians were killing each other over whether the Holy Trinity was paganism or not. Nobody was sure. And then suddenly, a Byzantine emperor was like, all right, guys, you are disrupting my tax revenue by killing each other. And so we're just going to have a meeting and we're going to decide that the Holy Trinity is kosher, to borrow a term from Judaism. So nobody killing anybody else. Holy Trinity, good now. Okay, cool. So from that point on, that was Christian canon, and the only justification for that was just state stability. But now Christian will be like, oh yeah, that's the way it's always been. Praise God, Holy Trinity. But it's just like you have to really understand that it didn't always used to be that way, and you can't use the justification of the way it is now is the way it was when God made it so, because that's not true. So you gotta understand the historical background of your own religion before you start saying things about it. And something interesting that you were mentioning in response to Rima earlier about the terminology of Israel and Palestine, and Judaism and Judea. Around the Egyptian New Kingdom in like 1100 BCE, the regions of Judah or Judea are interchangeable, most likely. And what would later be called Palestine, or like Philistia at that moment, they were both regions in the land of Canaan. Like the land of Canaan was like the name that the Canaanites, for the most part, called themselves, and everybody else called them. The later famous Phoenicians would also come from this land, and like the northern part of it. So like the land of Canaan would have stretched from the southern tip of what is now Israel until the Gaza Strip, and the northern tip of like Lebanon. So like that entire coast, all Canaanites. In fact, the Phoenicians themselves never called themselves Phoenicians. They probably called themselves either Canaanites or from whatever city they came from. The name Phoenician is Greek. The Greeks called them that, and the name just stuck, and now everybody calls them that. So calling people names that didn't come from themselves isn't necessarily alien. And Judah and Philistia, or Palestine, were both small regions in that larger Canaanite area that, they fought each other, but there were also other regions of other peoples that called themselves differently. But usually when one people rises to dominate other peoples in that area, everybody else just kind of takes on the name of the dominant group. And so, Palestine, or Philistia, the land of the Philistines, and Judah, or the land of the Jews, or Israel, the land of the Israelites, all of those names were kind of interchangeably used, like by a lot of different empires, to refer to that area of land. Because when, say the Assyrians, they come to the kingdom of Israel, which is like the dominant power in the area at that time. But it's not just Israelites. Maybe Israelites make up 15-20% of the population, and the other 80% are various amalgamations of groups of different Canaanites who have, different cultural heritage and stuff. But the Assyrians encounter the power in the region, Israel. So they're just like, okay, so this region is Israel. I mean, they don't really care about all the intricacies. They're just trying to rule a province. So they come into contact with the powerful group in the area, and they just call the whole area the name of that group. I mean, that doesn't make that any less valid. I'm just saying that, different empires and different states over history have used those names interchangeably to refer to the same area. And the same way the Romans changed the name of their province from Judea to Syria Palestine to screw it to the Jews, that's true. But the Romans didn't get that name from nowhere. Like, the Romans were occupying that land from the Greeks, or I should say the Seleucid Greeks, Middle Eastern influenced Greeks that came from Alexander the Great. So the Romans took that name and called it Palestine because it had already been called Palestine as a whole by other groups in the past. They didn't get it from nowhere. So, like, historically, those names are interchangeable. And it's only now, with like the political friction between the Palestinian territories and Israel, that using one name or the other identifies you as in support of one group and in dehumanization of the other group. But historically, that has not been the case. People who live there could be called Palestinians or Israelites or Canaanites or Jews. And at some point, those were all interchangeable. So I just want to caution against like saying that one is like a corruption of the other. Like, for instance, when Jesus was born, he was a Jew, but he could also be called a Palestinian. Like, he could be a Palestinian Jew, a Jewish Palestinian. Like, to the Romans, that would have been the same thing, because they would have identified the area as both. So
I just want to very briefly clarify what I'm saying, and also offer a minor historical correction as well. So I think it would be equally anachronistic, and to my historical sense, almost as offensive, to call Jesus an Israeli as a Palestinian. Both are anachronisms. Both of those demonyms came much later. Jew or Judean are historically accurate. With regard to the name from the Philistines, Philistia, that region was much smaller. You're right that Judea and Canaan and Israel and Palestine are all roughly the same area, but Philistia was a very small section of Canaan around Gaza, as you mentioned. And by the time that Jesus was alive, there had been no Philistines for a good long while. That was his historical past thing. Nobody was still referring to the area as Philistia.
I mean, that's because they've been assimilated culturally into the area, but the area itself could be referred to as Palestine and had been so by several different groups. I'm not saying it's a better name or a more dominant name. I'm saying it's an equally valid name. It's a geographical term as opposed to the cultural identifier that it used to be.
The notion of referring to the entire area of Canaan as Palestine, by the way, including all the way up into Syria, that originated 100 years after Jesus' death. I would disagree. Referring to the area around Gaza as Philistia, yes, that's historically earlier. But the idea of extending that term to the entire area and more post-dates Jesus by a good 100 years.
I think you might be confusing the official usage of that term by a state entity with that term in common dialect. Because the
You're
Roman
talking about there are historical primary sources of like people casually referring to the area that way.
I can definitely find them for you.
Okay, that sounds good, but that's also slightly tangential. So,
fair enough.
we'll put that in with like an asterisk note, and then after the meeting we can share references because that's actually, both tedious and very important. So yeah. Okay, cool.
Understandable. I want to quickly touch on what you said, Bilal, before I finish. The point you made about the dehumanizing on Earth in practical terms as opposed to theological disagreement, I think that's important because a lot of people don't really separate those things. Like, for instance, as a Christian or Muslim, you can believe, that somebody is going to hell theologically because they don't agree with you, but at the same time, in everyday life, treat them as a fellow human being and don't treat them any differently than you would a fellow Christian or a fellow Muslim. But you can believe in your own head that, you've been exposed to what I consider to be the truth and you have refused it, and therefore my God is going to send you to hell. But I'm not going to treat you any differently on earth because of that fact. I just believe that to be true. And some people don't separate those things. They're just like, my God will send you to hell when you die, and therefore I don't have to treat you with any respect while you're alive. And that is too common a thing. So I'm glad you brought that up. So now I'll pass it to whoever wants to talk.
I'll talk. So, yeah, I guess I feel like that's a really hard distinction, though, to think like you're for sure going to hell, but I still have to treat you like a good person. I feel like it's like emotionally problematic. I feel like humans aren't that good at compartmentalizing feelings. I know, and I feel like it sort of creates this idea that they're subhuman and that there's something inherently wrong with them. And so I feel like that's really difficult. And maybe in theory, you're right, but I feel like humans aren't very good at that. And so I do wish that larger theology or like wouldn't condemn people to hell, because I feel like that's really difficult to go through your life treating people like people and believing that somewhere deep in your soul.
So here's the thing, right? Like, a person could say, like, how can I fathom an infinite punishment for even, let's say, the worst crime in this life? Let's say a person's like, serial killer or worse, like a serial rapist, or, like, I don't say this lightly. I'm sorry to bring up such a vulgar case, but, like, you know what I mean? Like, I'm trying to bring up the most
heinous thing.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so, that at the end of the day, that is a finite action, and some people try to like understand, like they can't wrap their mind around like how can there be an infinite punishment for that and such and such. But at the same time, it's like, yeah, there are things that we couldn't fathom to possibly have made sense and been correct and be valid 20 years ago. So it's like, if there's an all-powerful being and like that we are not even like the smartest person on earth isn't like a grain of sand to them. They're not in the cosmos, not in like, how we can see so far out into the galaxy, but not like we have a limit to how we can see, and we can see many different galaxies and some such, that it's not like a grain of sand. Like, it's not like that would be such a exact, like that is, not comparable. So it's like, okay, well, like, considering that, then it's like, logically speaking, I don't think I have the grounds to say that it's beyond what could be correct. I could say that as far as I can understand, it doesn't seem fair, but I can also say that like there are tons of things that don't seem right that professionals say that I know that I'm like, all right, I can put my faith in this because they're a lot more qualified than me. They're and that's other humans who that like if you studied, you could actually catch up to them. Whereas in this case, it's like the idea is that like this is beyond us. This is far beyond. Secondly speaking, that's not the only view that there is. There is also the view of a cleansative period, where it's like, yeah, you did bad things. That's what you get. You get a period of hell. Like, you do bad, you earned it. You earned it, you know. And there's also the view that
Wait,
you
well, if I may interject a bit, are you saying that's like a temporary hell for like a finite number of sins, and then you get sent to heaven?
Yeah, that is an accepted view in Islam. That is an accepted view.
Interesting.
Yeah. Although, like, you know, if you go to ISIS, that won't be an accepted view. But
Like I said, like, this was actually not like an attack on like Islam. I think all religions definitely have their moments where like that person definitely going to hell. And like, I think in general, I feel like it's really hard for humans who are just so mortal to decide the will of the immortal. And I feel like it actually sort of condemns ourselves in the process, because it's really hard to
compartmentalize.
Thank you.
I definitely understand. I definitely understand, but at the same time, like yeah, that's a struggle of being a human. Like, if you screw up on that, that's a pretty big deal. You've done something horrible. I get what you're saying. Like, okay, if like scripturally speaking, it's very clear that like, hey man, like, you just cheated on your wife. Like, if we had the opportunity, like you would be like that could warrant the death penalty. If that, and additionally, that wouldn't just be like like that happened. It's also a theological and ideological aftermath of that. Like, that was considered a major sin, like almost on the grounds of polytheism. So, like, I get what you're saying. Like, it's hard to compartmentalize, but at the same time, it's like, well, that just sucks about being a human. That is a weakness that we have. Like, Eriq says a funny joke and he dressed nice that day, I might treat him more with respect and humanity than a homeless person who dresses like a bum and he smells bad.
That's been pretty funny.
And that's a real thing. Like, yeah, we suck at that. Like we, financially speaking, we now, because we don't compartmentalize, we see this person as less human because they have a lower fashion or lower hygiene, and it might not even be in their hands, right? Like, who knows? Like, there's a surprisingly number of clean-shaven homeless people I've seen in my neighborhood. Yeah. But yeah, anyway.
I just feel like it's difficult when like an institution that claims to have like a direct line with God in some way is universally making these laws and ideas about how we have to view other people, whereas like instead of I find that difficult. But
like,
I guess kind of moving away from
in terms of logic, like, do you believe that that's logically inconsistent, or do you believe that it's emotionally very hard to accept?
It's emotionally hard to accept, and I believe like logically it's not our place to even do that.
You can also say that it's
logically it's not our place as a personal value.
Okay, fine.
Okay.
I was going to say, you might also say that it's it can be dangerous given historical precedent.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
That's what I'm looking for.
Like, has it been weaponized before? Absolutely. Like, if we ask this question, like, has there ever been something that could be weaponized that wasn't weaponized? If yes, don't worry, it will be weaponized soon. Like,
koalas. Prove it.
Sooner or later, there'll be some sort of saying that, like, you're an indecent human because you don't care about the extinction of this animal.
But that's
and as a result, you truly are a corrupt and wicked person, and we should eat you as the underclass. I'm not even joking. That is a very realistic view on things.
I mean.
No, koalas are worthless animals. They poison themselves. They literally fill their brains with neurotoxins.
All right, folks.
They're dumb enough to not be dangerous.
To the folks at home, Bilal has been outed as a sociopath. We all know that now. Thank you, Bilal, for outing yourself.
So I actually wanted to like kind of take a hard left turn here. So in my personal life, I've been thinking a lot about when I get married, I'm going to cover my hair. And so this has been like a topic that I've been sort of seeking out a lot more. And I know this is a pretty hard left turn, but I promise I'm going to bring it back. And it sort of made me think about different conceptions from the outside of our community versus the inside of the community, and how the same outsiders will perceive different communities with similar laws. And so I guess like I'm personally having a lot of trouble with the idea that what I find anecdotally is that there are a lot of people who will say that Muslim women are not oppressed if they want to wear hijab. They're empowered, they're beautiful, they're women, whatever. And I agree with that, totally. But on the same side, the same people or the same group of people, the same outsiders to both religions will in turn say that Jewish women are inherently oppressed because we want to wear a sheitel, a wig, or a tichel, a scarf. And so I find that like really difficult, like as far as like inside outside perceptions. And there are definitely women who probably are oppressed and probably are pressured into it in probably both communities. But I wouldn't say that that's by far the majority. And so we kind of have this interplay of like, there maybe are some people who feel like that. So you can't really quite call it a misconception. But on the other hand, I feel like that's definitely not the majority. And I feel like part of what contributes to that is actually Jews. I feel like we're more liberal, or Jews that have left the more insular orthodoxy will monetize their experiences by sharing their oppression or ideas of oppression. And so I feel like there is sort of an outside-inside interplay kind of within our own community, where you could be an Orthodox Jew and call that the inside, and you can be a Reformed Jew and that could be its own outside, but you fall under this Jewish umbrella, so you're sort of given this guise of being a Jew, guise of being an insider. And so I don't really see that in the Muslim community. And so I don't really have anything brilliant to say about it or how to fix it or anything, but that's something that I've really noticed within my own community that I find really troublesome. And then, because we're obviously not going to let it go, so I might as well say what I'm going to say. If somebody were to write a bibliography about me or something like that, it would be pretty weird if they said I was from Michigami, which is like the Native American word for Michigan. So like, while it might have been valid like 100, 200 years ago, it'd be kind of weird to call me that now. And even if we went back to like some sort of like Michigan,
yes, but there will be a time and place for this. There's references coming soon at the end of the meeting. We have limited time.
Okay. I'm ready for the references. I just feel like they have to be time appropriate. They actually have to be from 1 to 30 CE, because like you could totally find references.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm done. I don't know if anybody else wants to talk, but
well, I mean, go ahead, Rima.
For clarification with the whole Catholics hate or Orthodox and vice versa, that hasn't been true for a while. Like, I know, at least back home in the Middle East, we can go to Orthodox church and they can go to ours. My first cousins are Orthodox. My aunt married an Orthodox man and her kids are Orthodox, but doesn't mean they're like there's a hatred or anything. I would just like to clarify that. And then with the concept of the Eastern Church and Western Church, Western typically being Catholicism, we technically, usually as we think of Catholicism, we think of the Roman Catholic rite, but there are 23 other Eastern rites of Catholicism that aren't acknowledged at all, ever. And to think there's just like one combined universal thought, like, yes, this is true and you can't question it, that's not necessarily true. It's more diverse we all think of the Roman Catholic Church because, yes, Western Europe and American, but America, sorry, let me clarify that. But we tend to fail to acknowledge the experiences of other like groups. We tend to generalize, I feel, in thought of just generalize, we view it as a Western religion when a lot of minorities across the world practice it. And the fact that people think, yes, we only follow the hierarchy. Of course, we follow, at least the Catholic Church follows the Pope. That's not a question. But there are different thoughts and everything. So just wanted to point that out.
I just want to clarify something. In terms of people falling in love in relationships, there are tons of times when people who identify with an ideology that is diametrally opposed to another ideology, or like just like both of them cannot be both following their scripture and still get married. But the case Rima is referring to is not breaking any rules like that. Like, it is canonically permitted for
Yes.
Orthodox and Catholic to be married. Like,
Yes.
yeah. Just to be clear, just clarifies in case anyone was thinking that like, oh, this is just a romantic story. No, like, it's legit. It's like allowed to.
No.
And what I wanted to ask was, is it official doctrine for both or either that the other side is a legitimate and correct and true path as well?
I believe so, yes. I believe the only differences are in questions with the sacraments. I need to double check this. But with at least the Orthodox Church, from what I know, they do baptism, communion, and confirmation all at the same time. We Catholics usually do it, baptism when you're a baby, communion around 2nd grade, and then when you're older, they'll do confirmation depending on your age. But otherwise, yes.
That might have had to do with the idea of like limbo in Catholicism, which might not have ever been a thing in the Orthodoxy. I know like one other difference is like their calculation of like when the holidays are. So there's Orthodox Easter, which is later.
Yes.
I think it's really interesting though, because the Orthodox Church is like probably a lot closer to original source because the New Testament was written in Greek. And I know that the King James Bible was sort of inherently problematic with translation. So I think that's a really interesting interplay. Yeah.
I would like to just mention, I feel like more of the Eastern rites are closer to, like you said, the Orthodox, which are like closer to the original text. Like because like the traditions, the way we do Mass, like I know for Maronite, at least we do the parts of the Mass in Aramaic, and just like I feel traditionally wise, we're more, at least the Eastern rites are more similar to Orthodoxy, if that makes sense.
I would also like to clarify, and I have partaken in a misconception myself. I often forget about the many Eastern rites of the Catholic Church in what is now called the Middle East, and also the several different unique Orthodox churches in the area of the world in general, as in like the Coptic Orthodox Church, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, etc. But like the Orthodox churches that are mainly represented in Europe, which are like the descendants of the Byzantine Church, the Greek Orthodox Church, Serbian, Russian, etc. They have a lot of bad blood between the Roman Catholic Church that's headquartered in Rome, and that is like, very prevalent in Austria, Germany, or not Germany, Austria, France, Italy, and Spain and Portugal. But Catholics and Orthodox, live, side by side, pretty cool in the Middle East itself. But in Europe, funny enough, where the religion spread to, they don't like each other very much because of the Great Schism in the 1000s, where basically the original Orthodox patriarch in Constantinople was supposed to have authority over the bishop in Rome, but the bishop in Rome declared that they had actual authority, and they split from each other. and like they like sent like insults to each other, and that's why we have the traditional split between the two. So in the Middle East, what you said is true. Like as we were talking about, misconceptions are true of some and not of all. But in Europe, there's like a lot of bad blood between the groups that identify as either. But your point is taken, and that was a misconception that I played into in this conversation. So bring that full circle.
I did want to pose a question towards Rima. And the question is so that you can comment to Zakia. Zakia mentioned that she believes that Jewish women who wear a head covering may be seen as oppressed, and she also, or something along to this sort, and she also expressed that she can wrap her head around the idea that like Muslims or Muslim women more particularly also may face the same criticisms or people thinking these things outside, and some are she clarified that like in some cases it's valid, some cases it's not. But oddly, she said that, and I was wondering who is this people who thought that Jewish women are oppressed. And she did clarify that, like, in some cases it's Jewish people. But outside of that, that never occurred to me. Like, the idea of Jewish women covering their, like, I've always viewed Jewish women covering their head as, I always felt that it was a little bit more liberal as a religion in that regard. And as a result, like, it would be viewed somewhat like nuns, where it's like, yeah, that's cool. Like, that's fine. Not in the sense that like, oh, they're going to be dedicating their lives like nuns, but in the sense that like, nobody bats an eye when they see a nun. Nobody thinks like, oh, that poor nun. Or as far as I've ever met.
That's really interesting. So I guess the context I was trying to speak from is somebody who is going to be covering their hair soon. And so I pay attention to women who are more open about wearing a sheitel. I feel like some of the reason that it might not be so obvious is that not everybody knows that we wear wigs, and not every Jewish woman does wear wigs. So I feel like it's a little bit more private, whereas a hijab, you can't have a hijab.
We've known this whole time. No, but go ahead, dude.
No, sometimes I have it. I'm like, is that a wig or is that her hair? And I kind of do the thing. So when I'm on like people's Instagram pages or Facebook or whatever that promote sheitel wearing within their own community, or are sheitel machers, or they sell sheitels or tichels, or they wrap their hair or whatever, and I'm sort of like kind of involved in all of these like sort of online communities, you do see it a lot like in the comments and things like that of like, oh, you're oppressed, why are you doing this? This is inherently, you have internalized misogyny.
I thought those are online communities. Now you got to consider that might be very selective in what you're reading. That's why I want Rima to comment on, does she think, like, what has she felt about Muslim hijabs or seen in her communities? Because I feel like the fact that I wouldn't see it that way, and if Rima also ends up seeing something similar, then it might be your circles that are giving you that idea, as opposed to it's a strange way of me to make this logical point of logic, because it's like I'm saying you're looking at anecdotes, and I'll prove it by showing you other anecdotes that exists. So Rima, could you please comment on it?
Part of this is about the big TV series Unorthodox, right?
Zakia?
Part of what you're talking about, the societal idea of Jewish women being oppressed, comes from a recent TV series called Unorthodox, correct?
Yeah, I mean, in like a super specific context, but like also I just kind of see it in general. But I feel like Unorthodox was it made more people aware that if you're looking at an Orthodox Jewish woman and she's obviously married, she's probably wearing a wig if you can't tell. I feel like that's sort of what kind of like reignited this like conversation, if you will. I was gonna say something else, but I've lost it, so.
ADHD is a killer, bro.
So primarily in my experience, again, I can't speak for everyone, but at least within the Middle Eastern community, it's not this, we don't look upon, like down upon anyone who wears a head covering. My grandma, I was going to say teta, that's the Arabic word for grandma. My grandma used to wear one all the time. So at least within that community, I've never seen it as a problem. Like hijabis, they're fine. It's all the same. Like Zakia, I believe you mentioned nuns. Yes, that's fine. No one's looking down upon anyone. We're fine with the hijab. We're just fine with head coverings, at least in that situation. For us, it's more of a personal choice. If you want to, I know specifically with the Orthodox community, I think this is just a general rule for Orthodox Christianity. For women in their church have to wear a veil, at least their head has to be covered. But I guess outside, based on my experience with, like as in America, I guess maybe they would look down upon it more because they're like, oh, she has to follow these rules. But at least my experience as a Middle Eastern person, I've never seen a problem with that.
And I feel like that does make a really big difference because I feel like inherent feminism and self-realization and sexual liberation within the American context tends to be revolved around women expressing their sexuality and being less covered, not more covered. And so sort of it's very un-American to say I'm actually empowered by covering myself. And I feel like that's very strongly juxtaposed in a way that it's not within Middle Eastern communities. But actually, I remember what I was going to say. I feel like some of the misunderstanding and some of the hate kind of comes from a misunderstanding as to why we cover our hair. I feel like there are a lot of people who are very critical of the wigs because they don't understand why it's any different than wearing your own hair or why it's more modest or anything else. And I feel like there are a lot of people who think that our hair is inherently linked to our sexuality, and therefore if you don't have enough hair or blah blah blah, you're not pretty. And I feel like it almost causes people to be on the defensive when they encounter like a sheitel or a hijab. And so I feel like you kind of have these like two competing values of people who are like, well, there's nothing wrong with my hair. I don't know why you sexualize hair of all things. I don't get why you're doing this. This is weird. And also then there's this like inherently like I don't understand how your feminism, your female liberation could be so diametrically opposed to my idea of female liberation and sexual advocacy, I guess.
I totally agree with that, Zakia.
So unless anybody's got some final comments, I believe that we're going to wrap it up because as usual, we've talked longer than we intended.
Indeed, as usual. All right, well, thank you, Rima, for introducing this topic. Heated discussion in confines of, context is good. Iron sharpens iron. So this has been The Discourse.
If you enjoyed this discussion, please subscribe to The Discourse on YouTube, Spotify, or iTunes. And as always, please join the conversation at thediscourse2020.medium.com. Thank you for joining us on The Discourse.